The advertisement had been folded inside a week-old copy of the Denver Gazette when Ruth Calloway found it. She'd been using the paper to line the bottom of a crate, not reading it, not looking for anything in particular, when the words caught her eye like a hook in still water. Wanted. A wife for a working ranch in Redwood Flats, California. Woman must be able to ride, rope, and endure the demands of frontier life without complaint. No city women. No women of fragile health or fragile character. Write to Jacob Holt, Redwood Flats, California. She read it twice. Then she set the crate down on the floor of the storeroom and stood very still for a moment, the way a person does when a door they hadn't expected opens directly in front of them. Ruth Calloway was 22 years old. She was the daughter of a horse breeder who had died owing money to half the county, and the granddaughter of a woman who'd driven cattle alone across the Colorado Plateau at the age of 19 and never once thought to mention it was remarkable. She had grown up in the saddle, had learned to read a horse's mood the way other girls learned to read sheet music, had roped her first steer at 11, gentled her first difficult horse at 13, and by 15 was the one her father called on when a green colt was too much for the ranch hands to manage. She was also, as of 3 months ago, completely alone. Her father had gone first, a bad winter and worse lungs. Her mother had followed 6 weeks later, grief dressed up as pneumonia. Her 2 older brothers had scattered before the debts were even fully counted, one to Texas, one to parts she couldn't track. The farm had been sold to cover what was owed. She had walked away from it with her saddle, her grandfather's rope, $31, and a room at Mrs. Party's boarding house in Glenwood, Colorado, that she could only afford for another 2 weeks. She was not a woman who cried easily. She stood in that storeroom for a long moment, the advertisement in her hand, the smell of sawdust and dried beans around her, and she made a decision the way she'd always made hard ones, quickly and without flinching. She wrote to Jacob Holt that same night. She did not dress up the letter. She listed what she could do in plain language, the way you'd write an invoice. She could ride any horse put under her, astride or otherwise. She could rope and tie. She could drive a wagon, read weather, stretch a fence line, treat a sick animal, manage a household on next to nothing, and work from before first light until well after dark without requiring praise for any of it. She was not pretty in a soft way. She was not fragile in any way. She had $31 to her name and no family left to speak of, but she was not asking for charity. She was offering a fair exchange of labor and capability in return for a roof, a purpose, and the legal standing that came with marriage. She sealed the letter and posted it before she could change her mind. The reply came 11 days later. It was short, even shorter than her own letter. It said that her qualifications were satisfactory, that train fare was enclosed, that she should arrive in Redwood Flats no later than the 14th of May, and that she would be met at the station. It was signed J. Holt, not Jacob, not yours truly. Just the initial and the name, blunt as a boot heel. She decided she respected that. She packed everything she owned into a single canvas bag, settled her account with Mrs. Party, and said goodbye to no one in particular because there was no one in particular left to say it to. She boarded the westbound train on a Tuesday morning, found a window seat, and watched Glenwood disappear behind her without sentiment. The journey took 4 days. She watched the land change outside the glass, the high, dry plains of Colorado giving way to red desert, then the slow, green climbing of the Sierra foothills, and finally, the deep timber country of Northern California, where the redwoods rose on either side of the tracks, like the walls of a cathedral nobody had planned. She pressed her forehead against the cool glass and looked up at them and felt something she hadn't felt in months, like there might be something worth arriving to. Redwood Flats was a working town. She could see that immediately from the platform. The kind of place where the mud on the street came from actual work, and not just weather. There was a mill at the far end of the main road, a feed store, a blacksmith, a saloon that looked like it had opinions. The air smelled of pine resin, and horses, and wood smoke. She stepped off the train with her bag and looked around the platform. 2 men were standing near the far end of the station. One was older, wiry, and weathered, with the look of a man who had been squinting into the sun for 40 years and had made peace with it. The other was younger, mid-30s, she'd guess, tall and broad across the shoulder, with dark hair showing beneath a plain hat, and an expression that gave away exactly nothing. It was the younger one who moved first. He walked toward her with an unhurried stride, the kind that covered ground without appearing to try. He stopped 2 feet away and looked at her steadily. He had gray eyes, she noticed. Not cold gray, working gray. The color of sky before rain comes in useful. "Miss Calloway," he said. "Mr. Holt," she answered. He held her gaze for a moment, as if measuring something, then reached down and took her bag from her hand before she could argue. "Wagons out front. Long ride to the ranch. We can talk on the way." Ruth followed him around the side of the building. The older man fell into step behind them. "That's my foreman," Holt said over his shoulder. "Pete Garza. He runs the hands." Pete tipped his hat at her. "Ma'am." "Mr. Garza," she said. The wagon was solid and well kept, hitched to 2 big roans that stood quiet and attentive. Ruth looked the horses over automatically. Good depth through the chest, clean legs, calm eyes. Whoever cared for them knew what they were doing. Holt set her bag in the wagon bed and came around to help her up to the seat. She was already climbing before he got there. He noticed. Something shifted slightly in his expression, not quite amusement, not quite anything she could name. He climbed up beside her, gathered the reins, and released the brake with the ease of long habit. They rode out of town without speaking. The road north, out of Redwood Flats, climbed through timber country for the first hour, the light coming down through the redwoods in long amber columns. Then the trees thinned, and the land opened up into rolling pasture, gold and green, with a line of dark mountains sitting at the far edge of the world. Ruth looked at it and felt the tightness in her chest ease another degree. "How much land?" she asked. 340 acres, Holt said. "Pasture and timber both. Creek runs through the lower quarter. Never runs dry. I've got 60 head of cattle right now, 20 horses, and enough hay ground to winter them without buying." "Just you and Garza working it?" "3 other hands. Garza oversees. I work alongside them." He paused. "The advertisement said what I needed. I don't want a woman who'll stand at a window watching the work. I've got enough people doing that in town." "I've never stood at a window in my life," Ruth said. He glanced at her sideways, back to the road. "We'll see." She didn't bristle at it. He was right to be skeptical. Any man who'd placed that kind of advertisement had probably received plenty of letters from women who could ride, according to themselves, and had never sat a horse at speed in their lives. She didn't need to argue the point. She just needed to show him. They turned off the main road at a split-rail gate and followed a track through a stand of oaks. The ranch came into view gradually, like something being revealed rather than simply arrived at. First the barn, large, well-built, newer than she expected. Then the corrals, 4 of them, with horses moving in 2. Then the house, set back against a low hill. A long porch across the front, stone chimney, real glass in the windows. It was nothing grand, but it was solid. The way things built by hands that intended to stay are solid. Ruth felt something she recognized distantly as hope. Holt pulled the wagon up in front of the barn and set the brake. 2 of the ranch hands materialized from the side of the building. A younger one, maybe 20, with red hair and a grin that arrived ahead of him, and an older one, dark and quiet, who moved like someone comfortable with silence. "That's Danny Fay," Holt said, nodding toward the redhead, "and Cord Reyes." Danny Fay looked at Ruth with the open curiosity of someone who hadn't yet learned to hide what he was thinking. "You're the one who wrote the letter?" he said. "Danny," Holt said, a single syllable of warning. "Didn't mean anything by it," Danny said, grinning. "Just, Warren's been reading that letter about 4 times a day for 2 weeks. "That'll do," Holt said flatly. Ruth kept her expression neutral, but she filed that away. A man who'd read her letter 4 times in 2 weeks was a man who'd taken her seriously. That was worth something. Holt climbed down and came to the side of the wagon. Ruth was already down, had swung herself off the wheel before he made it around. He stopped when he saw her standing in the dirt. "You do that a lot?" he said. "Do what?" "Get there before I can offer a hand." "I've been getting down from wagons since I was 7, she said. "Didn't need help then either." Holt looked at her for a beat. Then he picked her bag up from the wagon bed and carried it toward the house. She followed. The inside was plain and clean in the way of a man who was organized, but didn't think much about comfort. The main room had a good table, two chairs by the fireplace that had seen hard use, and shelves of ledgers and supply receipts along one wall. The kitchen was functional. The curtains were none. He showed her to a bedroom at the end of the hall, small, with a window that looked out over the near pasture. A bed, a dresser, a hook on the wall, a lock on the door that looked recently installed. "I want to be clear about the arrangement," he said, standing in the doorway, his hat in his hands. "I'm not a man who's going to tell you one thing and mean another. What I wrote in that advertisement is what I meant. I need a partner who can work. I don't have anything softer to offer than that right now. If that's not what you were hoping for, I'll put you back on the train tomorrow. No hard feelings." Ruth turned from the window and looked at him directly. "What I was hoping for," she said, "was work I'm capable of and a place I can build something in. That's what you're offering, so we're agreed." He studied her for a moment, those working gray eyes steady and unreadable. Then he nodded once. "Supper's at 6. You don't have to cook tonight if you don't want to." "I'll cook," Ruth said. "You sure?" "Mr. Holt, I just rode 4 days on a train and I'm still standing. I can cook supper." He almost smiled. It barely made it to the surface, but she saw the edge of it before he turned and pulled the door closed behind him. Ruth sat on the edge of the bed and let out a slow breath. The room was quiet. Outside the window, one of the horses in the near corral moved along the fence line with long, easy strides. A dark bay, well-muscled, with a white star on his forehead. She watched it for a while. Then she unpacked her bag, hung her second dress on the hook, set her grandfather's rope coiled on the dresser, and went to find the kitchen. Supper that first night was beans, cornbread, and a pan of salt pork she found hanging in the larder. She fed 4 men and had everything on the table before Holt came in from the barn. Danny Fay ate with the urgency of someone who hadn't had a decent meal in recent memory and said so directly. Cord Reyes ate without comment, but had a second plate, which Ruth counted as the same thing. Pete Garza told her the cornbread was the best he'd had west of Texas. Holt ate steadily, watching her without appearing to watch her. After supper, when the men had gone to the bunkhouse and Ruth was washing up, he came and stood in the kitchen doorway. "You didn't have to feed the hands," he said. "They were hungry," she replied. "They eat in the bunkhouse usually." There was enough. Didn't make sense to cook it separate. She set a pan on the rack to dry. "What time does work start?" 5. "I'll be up at 4:30, she said. "Breakfast before we go out." He was quiet for a moment. "You don't have to work the ranch," he said carefully. "That wasn't part of Mr. Holt." She turned and looked at him. "I wrote to you because your advertisement said you needed a woman who could ride and work. I can do both. If you keep me in the kitchen, you're wasting what I told you I could do." "I'd rather not be wasted." Something moved in his face. Not surprise exactly. More like something he'd been quietly braced for had turned out to be real. "All right," he said. "Tomorrow then." She was awake at 4:15. By the time Holt came through the kitchen at 5, there was coffee, eggs, and biscuits on the table. He stopped in the doorway and looked at the food, and then at her in a way that she was starting to recognize. That brief recalibration, like a man adjusting a scope. They rode out after breakfast, the 5 of them, to move a section of the herd to the upper pasture. Ruth was given a stocky gray mare named Cora. She saddled Cora herself, checked the girth twice, and was mounted before Danny Fay had finished adjusting his stirrups. She felt Holt watching. She didn't perform for it. She just worked. Moving cattle was something her muscles knew before her mind had to think about it. She read the herd the way she'd been taught, watching the animals on the edge, the ones most likely to break, positioning before the problem rather than after it. When a young steer made a run for the tree line, she had Cora turned and moving before anyone called it, cutting the steer off and pressing him back into the group with clean, efficient pressure. She heard Danny Fay say something behind her. She didn't catch the words, but caught the tone. That shift men make when they revise an estimate downward about something they'd privately doubted. By midday, the herd was settled in the upper pasture, and they stopped at the creek to rest the horses. Holt crouched by the water and filled his canteen, and didn't say anything for a long moment. Then, "Where'd you learn to read a herd like that?" "My father," Ruth said. He believed the cattle would tell you what they were about to do if you bothered to listen. He sounds like he knew his work. He did, she said, until he didn't know anything else anymore and forgot how to stop. Holt looked at her steadily. He didn't ask what she meant. He just nodded, the way a person does when they recognize a kind of loss without needing it spelled out. I'm sorry, he said simply. Don't be, she said. It made me what I am. They rode back to the ranch in the loose, comfortable silence that she was already learning was Holt's native language. He wasn't a man who spoke to fill space. She found she didn't mind it. Over the days that followed, a shape emerged to her life at the ranch. And it fit her the way work that uses your actual abilities always fits. Not easy, but right. She was up before light. Breakfast for the hands by 5. Out with Holt and the others by past. Whatever the day required, fence line, cattle, equipment, hay, she worked it without being asked twice about anything. In the afternoons, she handled the house, the garden, the accounts, and she began to see patterns in the ledgers that told her where small money was being lost without anyone noticing. She mentioned it to Holt one evening when he was at the table going over figures. You're paying for winter hay delivery when Hanson's mill is selling cutting rights on the east quarter for half what you'd pay by the wagon, she said. He looked up. She had already laid it out on a separate sheet. The numbers were plain. He studied it for a long time without speaking. Then, where did you learn accounts? My mother taught me. She said a ranching woman who couldn't read a ledger was just an expensive problem. Holt almost laughed at that. Again, barely. Just that buried edge of amusement surfacing and going under again. Your mother sounds like she was worth knowing. She was, Ruth said. Both of them were, before they weren't anymore. She went back to her mending. Holt went back to the figures, but she noticed he was now working from the sheet she'd written. 3 weeks after Ruth arrived at the Holt ranch, Pete Garza pointed to a horse in the far corral and told her that animal was the reason Jacob Holt had 3 fewer ranch hands than he'd started the year with. The horse was a black stallion, maybe 16 hands, with a deep chest and legs that belonged on something bred to run. Beautiful in the way of a storm, something you admired at a distance with specific respect. He's not broke, Ruth asked. He's been started, Pete said carefully. 3 times. He's bucked off every man who's tried to finish him. Danny went over the rail. Cord came away with a broken finger. Jake tried himself 2 weeks before you arrived. He paused. He doesn't talk about that. Ruth studied the horse. The stallion stood at the far end of the corral, watching her the way difficult horses watched people, not fearfully, but with sharp, measuring attention. His ears were forward. His muscles were coiled without being rigid. He's not mean, she said. Pete looked at her sideways. Ma'am, that horse threw Cord Reyes 8 feet. That's not mean. That's scared, Ruth said. Different problem, different solution. She went to the house and changed into her working clothes. When she came back out, Holt was standing at the fence. She hadn't seen him come out, didn't know how long he'd been there. Pete said you want to try the black, he said. I want to spend time with the black, she said. Trying comes later. Holt's jaw tightened. Ruth, I'm not going to ride him today, she said. I'm going to go in there and stand with him, that's all. She met his eyes. I know what I'm doing. He held her gaze. Then he stepped back from the fence. She entered the corral through the gate, latched it behind her, and moved to the center of the space. She didn't approach the horse. She turned slightly sideways, non-confrontational, smaller, and stood still. The stallion watched her. She began to speak, low and even, the kind of voice that carries no urgency in it. Not words that meant anything, just sound, rhythm, the signal of something unhurried, in a world he'd learned to associate with force and confusion. His ears moved, tracking her. She took 2 steps to the left, not toward him, just movement, slow and without agenda. She waited. After 7 minutes, she counted without looking like she was counting. The stallion shifted his weight and took 1 step in her direction. She heard Danny Faye say something low and urgent from outside the fence. She heard Pete shush him. She stayed still. Another step, then 2 more. The stallion stretched his neck toward her, nostrils wide, reading her at a distance. She let him. She didn't move to meet him or pull back from him. She just remained, steady as a post, until his breath moved the hair at her temple. She lifted her hand very slowly and laid it against the flat of his jaw. He held. A deep tremor moved through him like a bell being struck, but he held. Outside the fence, nobody said anything. She worked with him that way for 5 days, just presence and patience. She named him Slate, for the color of him in flat light. By the 4th day, he was following her around the corral at liberty. No halter, no rope, just trailing her like a question that had found its answer. On the 5th day, she put the saddle blanket on him. He stood for it. On the 7th day, she was on his back. She heard someone exhale outside the fence like they'd been holding their breath for a week. She thought it might have been Holt. Slate was not easy even then. He had opinions and he expressed them, but he didn't buck. He tested and she answered, and they negotiated, and by the end of that first ride, she could feel the beginning of trust in the way he carried himself differently under her. Looser, more through the back, the tight defensive brace in his body slowly releasing. When she dismounted and led him back to the gate, Holt was the only one still at the fence. The others had drifted back to work at some point. He was leaning with both arms on the top rail, and he was looking at her the way she'd caught him looking before. That expression she hadn't been able to name in those early days. She could name it now. It was the look of a man who had stopped being surprised and started being moved. "How did you know?" he said quietly. "Know what?" "That he wasn't mean." "Because mean horses don't look at you that way. They look through you. He was always looking at me. He wanted to understand." She stroked Slate's neck. He just needed someone who was willing to be understood back. Holt said nothing for a moment. Then, "Where did you get that kind of patience?" Ruth looked at the horse. "Same place I got everything else," she said. "I didn't have a choice." It happened slowly, the way things between two careful people always happen. Not in one moment, but in the accumulated weight of many small ones. It was in the way Holt started asking her opinion on ranch decisions before he made them. Not performing consultation, but genuinely waiting for her answer, turning it over, factoring it in. It was in the way she found herself watching the set of his shoulders at the end of the day and knowing by the angle of them whether the day had gone well or badly. It was in the evenings when they sat at the table after supper, him with his ledgers and her with her mending or her reading, and the silence between them was no longer simply comfortable. It was something she had started looking forward to. She was 8 weeks into her life at the ranch when Holt came in from the far pasture at midday, 2 hours earlier than usual, his face carrying something she hadn't seen there before. She was at the kitchen table going over the feed accounts. She looked up when he came through the door. "There's a problem," he said. He sat down across from her and laid his hat on the table. She waited. "A man named Burl Casson has been running cattle across the South Quarter," he said. "He did it last spring, too. Claimed the fence line was wrong, that the land was disputed. It wasn't, but it cost me 2 months and a lawyer to prove it." He paused. "He's back. His hands cut the south fence 2 nights ago, moved 30 head of his cattle onto my grazing." "Is he claiming the same thing again?" "He's claiming whatever gets him what he wants," Holt said, "which is access to my creek water. He overgrazed his own south pasture 3 years running, and now his creek tributary is silted to nothing. He wants mine." Ruth looked at the map on the wall. She'd studied it in her first week, learned the property lines, the way she'd learned the layout of every ranch she'd ever lived on. "How many hands does he run?" she asked. 6 or 7, rough ones." "And the sheriff?" "Coleman is a fair man, but he's one man with a lot of ground to cover. By the time he gets out here, Casson's cattle have grazed another 2 days on my feed, and Casson's men have made themselves at home." Ruth folded her hands on the table. "Then we move them ourselves," she said. Holt looked at her. "They'll push back." "Then we be more inconvenient than they are," she said steadily. "We document where his fence line actually is. We move the cattle back across it ourselves with witnesses, and we ride to Coleman before Casson does to put our account on record first." She paused. "And we fix the south fence that same day, so there's no gap to point at." Holt was quiet for a moment. "You've dealt with this before," he said. My father's neighbor ran cattle across our east line every spring for 4 years, she said. Different man, same thinking. He stopped when it cost him more trouble than it was worth. Men like that don't want to fight. They want an easy advantage. You take the easy out of it, they move on. She watched him think it through, watched him find no fault in it. All right, he said. We ride this afternoon. They went out in the afternoon, Holt, Pete, Danny, Cord, and Ruth, with the ranch's second horse following for the cattle. Casson's men were there, 2 of them, sitting on the fence, watching with the aggressive ease of people who expected to be accommodated. Ruth drove the first of Casson's cattle back across the line herself, on Slate, who had become her horse in all but legal name. She moved the cattle with authority. No hesitation, no invitation to discussion. When one of Casson's men rode over and said something low and pointed to Holt, she turned Slate in front of him without being asked to, and looked at the man with an expression that had nothing soft in it. The fence line is staked at 400 feet south of the creek bend, she said. That's recorded in the county ledger, dated 1881. If you want to dispute it, you're welcome to do that in Coleman's office. We'll be there at 9 tomorrow morning. The man stared at her. Or you can move your cattle back yourself and save everyone the ride, she added. He looked at Holt. Holt said nothing, just returned the look with the gray-eyed steadiness that was his particular kind of authority. The man turned his horse and went back to his companion. They moved the remaining cattle themselves. Riding back to the ranch, Pete came up beside Ruth and said, without looking at her, You know, most women would have stayed at the house. I'm aware, Ruth said, Holt wouldn't have asked you to come. I know that too. But you came anyway. It's my ranch too, she said simply. At least the legal certificate says so. Pete nodded slowly, like something had been confirmed. He dropped back and rode with Cord, and Ruth heard them talking in low tones that she didn't try to catch. Holt rode beside her in silence for the rest of the way back. But at the gate, when he dismounted to unlatch it and held it as she rode through, he held her gaze for a moment longer than the task required. Thank you, he said quietly. You don't need to thank me, Ruth said. This is what I came here to do. I know, he said. I'm thanking you anyway. The trouble with Casson didn't end with the fence line. 3 weeks after the cattle were moved back, Ruth woke in the deep of the night to a smell that didn't belong. Acrid, sharp, wrong in the particular way of things burning that should not be burning. She was at the window in seconds. The barn, not fully aflame yet, but the south wall was lit, and the fire was climbing with that terrible calm efficiency that fire has when it has decided it is going somewhere. She had the door open and was calling Holt's name before she'd pulled on her boots. He was already in the hall. They ran. What happened in the next hour lived in her body long after her mind had tried to make sense of it. Holt and Pete and the hands attacked the fire with everything available. Water from the creek hauled up the slope in a chain, soaked grain sacks, brute work. Ruth went into the barn. She went in because the horses were in there. She knew it was dangerous. She knew the smoke was already thick, and the horses were panicked, and that a panicked horse in a burning building was one of the most hazardous things she would ever face. She knew all of that, and she went in anyway, because she also knew that if she didn't, those horses would die. She went in 4 times. Each time was worse than the last. More smoke, more heat, the structure beginning to speak in deep groans above her. Each time she came out with a horse, got it to the far corral, and went back. Slate was last. He was the most panicked, crashing against the walls of his stall, whites showing around his eyes. She went to him and put her hands on either side of his face in the dark, and spoke and said his name, just his name, over and over, until he stilled enough to lead. She brought him out into the night air, and the horse stood trembling against her, and she realized her hands were shaking too. All 12 horses were out. None were lost. The south side of the barn was a ruin. The rest was damaged, but standing. Holt fought the fire until dawn, when it was finally out, and then he stood in the ash and the early light and looked at what was left. They found the kerosene tin behind the far fence post that morning. The tracks of 2 horses coming and going from Casson's direction. Holt rode to town and spoke to the sheriff. Ruth went with him, because she had seen the tracks and could describe them, and because she was done being anywhere that wasn't where the decisions were being made. Coleman was thorough. He took the tin. He took their statements and her description of the tracks. He rode out to the site himself. 2 weeks later, after a longer investigation that pulled in testimony from 2 other ranchers who'd had trouble with Casson's men, Burl Casson was arrested and charged with arson. He was convicted 4 months later and sentenced to 7 years. The barn took 6 weeks to rebuild. During those 6 weeks, Ruth noticed that Holt had gone somewhere inside himself that he wouldn't easily come out of. He worked harder than anyone, was the first one lifting and the last one to put down a tool, but there was something behind his eyes that was different from the steady quiet she had come to know. One evening, she found him sitting on the front steps alone after the others had gone to bed, looking out at the dark shapes of the hills. She sat down beside him. "Say what you're thinking," she said. "You've been carrying it around for days." He was quiet for a long time. Then, "You went into that barn 4 times. "Yes." The 4th time, that beam over the center aisle was already going. "I know. You could have been killed." His voice was level, but there was something beneath it that wasn't. "Over horses. Over our horses," she said quietly. He turned to look at her. In the dim light from the house window, his face was open in a way she hadn't seen it before. The careful self-containment he carried like a second coat had slipped, and what was beneath it was something raw and honest, and more revealing than he probably intended. "I don't know when it happened," he said, "but somewhere in the last 3 months, I stopped thinking about this as an arrangement." Ruth held very still. "I should have said it before now," he continued. "I know that. I'm not a man who finds words easy, but I'd rather say it plain and late than never. I care about you, Ruth, not as a hand and not as a practical solution to what I needed. I care about you." He stopped. "If you don't feel the same way, I'll respect that. The arrangement stands either way. I won't make it uncomfortable." Ruth looked at this man, at his honest face and his rough hands, and the way he had never once in 3 months treated her as less than what she was. She thought about the mornings she had watched him ride out and felt something in her chest track his direction across the pasture. She thought about how his rare smiles felt like weather changing. She thought about the barn and how when the fire was finally out and she'd come to stand beside him in the ash and the gray dawn, the first thing she had felt was relief. Not for the barn, not for the horses. For him. "Jacob," she said, the first time she had used his given name. "I came here out of necessity, that's true, but what I feel now has nothing to do with necessity." He looked at her for a long moment. "Can I—" he started. "Yes," she said, before he finished. When he kissed her, it was nothing like the brief formal ceremony of their wedding 6 weeks prior. It was warm and careful and searching, the way a man touches something he intends to keep. They sat on the front steps for a long time after, his arm around her shoulders, her head leaning slightly against him, watching the stars move overhead in the slow way they do when you finally stopped rushing toward something and can simply be where you are. Ruth had been a practical woman her whole life. She did not change the habit now, but she found, to her own careful surprise, that practicality and love were not the opposites she had always assumed. In the hands of 2 people willing to be honest with each other, they were simply the same thing expressed differently. The ranch continued to grow. With Slate fully broken and trained, Ruth took on the breaking of 2 more young horses that had been sitting in the far corral, waiting for someone with the time and skill. Word moved through the county, the way word does in country, where people pay attention to capability. By the following spring, 2 neighboring ranches had brought their problem horses to her. She charged a fair rate. The money went into the barn repair account first, then into a plan they laid out together at the kitchen table on a rainy evening in November. More land, more horses, a proper breaking corral. She was 5 months along when she told him. They were in the barn, of all places. She was checking Slate's left hind, which had been slightly off, and Holt was forking hay into the rack. She straightened up and said, "Jacob, there's going to be a baby." He put down the fork. He stood there in the barn with the smell of hay and horses around them, and looked at her with an expression she had never quite seen on him before. Not the quiet recalibration, not the almost smile, something wider and more unguarded than any of that. "You're certain?" he said. "I'm certain." He crossed the barn and took her face in his hands very gently, the way he'd kissed her the first time, as if she were something he hadn't allowed himself to believe in until it was actually there. "Are you?" she began. "Ruth," he said, "I am the furthest thing from anything but grateful." Danny Fay found out 3 days later because Danny Fay found out about everything 3 days later. His reaction was to whoop loud enough to startle the horses and then look immediately guilty about startling the horses. Pete Garza shook Holt's hand and then turned to Ruth and said, with great seriousness, that she was the best thing that had happened to this ranch, and that included the good water year of 1882. Ruth laughed at that, a real one, unguarded. Holt, watching her from across the yard, looked like a man who had found something he hadn't known he was searching for. Their son was born in early summer, after a long labor that Holt sat through without leaving her side. When it was finally over, and the doctor put the child in her arms, Ruth looked down at this red-faced, indignant, entirely new person, and felt something so large she had no word for it. She had thought, once, that she was a woman built mostly of endurance. She was revising that now. They named him Thomas for her father's best quality, his stubbornness in the face of hard things. Holt held his son for the first time with the exquisite caution of a large, capable man suddenly faced with something very small and entirely dependent, and he looked so thoroughly undone by it that Ruth, exhausted as she was, had to press her lips together to keep from smiling. "Hello," Holt said to the baby very quietly. Thomas looked up at him with the unfocused gravity of the newly arrived. "He has your eyes," Holt said. "He has your jaw," Ruth said. "God help him." Holt did laugh at that. Fully, no reservations, the laugh she'd worked hard to get out of him in those early months, and now heard freely. He sat on the edge of the bed and held his son and looked at Ruth and said, "I want you to know something." "What?" "I know you came here because you needed to. I know it started as a transaction, and I want you to know that I understand that, and I'm not trying to rewrite it." He paused. "But I also want you to know that the day you stepped off that train with that canvas bag and looked at me like you were prepared to work rather than be kept, that was the day I thought for the first time in years that this ranch might actually become something." Ruth was quiet for a moment. "You read my letter 4 times, she said. He blinked. "Danny told you that." "Danny tells everyone everything." "I'm going to fire Danny." "You're not going to fire Danny," she said. He looked at her, that buried smile, all the way to the surface now. "No," he said, "I'm not." The years at Redwood Flats did not pass gently, because years on a working ranch never do. They passed with the weight of seasons, dry ones and wet ones, good calf crops and bad ones, the slow, ongoing work of keeping something alive and growing that the land and the weather and the market were all indifferent to. They passed with loss, too. Pete Garza went home to his family in New Mexico when his mother fell ill and never came back, though he wrote letters for years. A bad winter in 1889 took 12 head and set them back 2 seasons in their plan to expand the horse operation. But they also passed with Thomas, growing from a squalling infant into a serious, watchful boy who had his father's quiet and his mother's eye for horses. When he was 3, he was already underfoot in the barn. When he was 5, he was on a horse. When he was 8, Ruth found him in Slate's corral, working with the old stallion the same way she had the first time. Sideways, quiet, patient, letting the horse come to him. She stood at the fence and watched for a long time without interrupting. When Thomas came out, she said, "Where did you learn to do that?" "I watched you," he said simply. She had to look away for a moment at that. Their daughter came 2 years after Thomas, a child who arrived with strong opinions and expressed them immediately and didn't stop. They named her Clara, for no one in particular, and Clara was nothing like her brother in temperament, but had both her parents' stubbornness in full measure. By the time she was 7, she was following Ruth around the breaking corral like an apprentice, taking it all in. Holt looked at his daughter one evening, watching her from the porch as she marched across the yard with total conviction, and said to Ruth, "She's going to give us trouble. She's going to be formidable. Ruth corrected. Those are the same thing in a girl that age. They're the same thing in a woman any age, Ruth said. You did fine with me. He put his arm around her shoulders. I did better than fine, he said. I did everything right. The horse operation grew into what they'd planned and then past it. Ruth's reputation for bringing on difficult horses had become established enough that by 1891, people were coming from 3 counties. Holt expanded the upper corral. They hired 2 new hands, both recommended by Danny Fay, who had married a woman from town and was building his own small place nearby and had settled into the solid satisfaction of a man who ended up exactly where he was supposed to be. On their 10th anniversary, Jacob Holt rode with Ruth back to the ridge above the ranch at sunset, the same ridge she had first seen the property from on that wagon ride from Redwood Flats. They sat on their horses side by side in the cooling evening and looked at what was below them. The expanded barn, the 4 corrals, the house with its new west wing, Thomas visible in the near paddock with a young bay horse, Clara sitting on the fence watching him. I want to tell you something, Ruth said. Tell me, he said. When I answered that advertisement, I told myself I was being purely practical. That I needed security in a situation, and that was all it was. She paused. I told myself that for a long time, actually. Long after I knew it wasn't true anymore. He looked at her. I love you, Jacob, she said. Not because of the ranch, and not because of the children, and not because of anything you've built. Because of who you are when none of that is in the room. Because you're the most honest person I've ever known, and you've never once tried to make me smaller than I am. She looked at the view. I should have said it plainly years ago. He was quiet for long enough that she looked at him. His jaw was working very slightly. She recognized it now, the particular effort he made when he was feeling something that the words weren't large enough for. Ruth, he finally said, you broke a horse that 3 men couldn't manage. You walked into a burning barn 4 times. You fixed my accounts, my fence line, and my temper, roughly in that order. He paused. You think I don't know what I've got? She smiled. He reached across the space between their horses and took her hand. They sat there until the light was gone from the sky and Clara's voice drifted up from below, calling them down for supper in the tone of a child who has waited long enough and is prepared to say so. They grew old on that land. Not gracefully, ranching doesn't allow for graceful aging. They grew old the way the ridge behind the house grew old, a little more weathered each season, a little more settled into the ground, more rooted and less easily moved. Holt's dark hair went gray at the temples and then all the way through. Ruth's hands grew more capable of predicting rain than any instrument. Thomas took over the day-to-day running of the cattle operation in his mid-20s and proved to be better at it than either of them would say out loud in front of him, for fear of making him unbearable. Clara became the horse operation, full stop. She had surpassed her mother by the time she was 18, which Ruth regarded with the specific pride of someone who intended to be surpassed and had planned for it. They sat on the porch in the evenings, the way they always had. The silence between them by now so well worn, it was like furniture, something you moved around without thinking, present and necessary, and entirely taken for granted in the best way. On their 30th anniversary, the children organized a gathering that involved most of the county and all of the people who had come through their lives in 3 decades. Neighboring ranchers, old hands, families who'd bought horses from Ruth, people who'd simply known them long enough to count as part of the fabric of the place. Someone pushed them onto the cleared ground in front of the barn for a dance, and Holt looked at Ruth and said, "My knees aren't what they were." "Neither are mine," she said. "We could just stand here and pretend." "We could," she said. He put his hand on her waist, and they moved slowly in the lamplight, not following any particular music, just moving together the way they did everything, without needing to explain it to each other, without needing to plan. Thomas was watching from across the yard. Clara was standing beside him. Later, Thomas would tell his own children about that moment, the 2 of them turning slowly in the light, while around them everything else moved at the pace of a celebration. He'd say, they looked like they were the only 2 people there, not because they ignored everyone else, but because they'd spent 30 years making a world together that was completely self-sufficient. He was right. That was exactly what it was. Jacob Holt died at 84. in the house he had built, in the bed he had shared with Ruth for 51 years. It was early morning, the particular blue-gray hour before the light comes in, and Ruth was holding his hand. She had known it was coming. He had known it was coming. They had said what needed to be said, all of it, over many evenings on that porch, said it in words and in the kind of quiet that is itself a language between people who've had long enough to learn each other. She stayed on the ranch. Thomas and Clara both offered to stay with her, and she declined both, firmly, in the tone of voice that her children had learned not to argue with. She was not fragile. She had never been fragile. She simply needed time to adjust to the new shape of the life she still had. She lived 7 more years, active until the last 2, sharp until the end. She worked with horses until her body would no longer let her, and then she supervised, which turned out to suit her temperament rather well. She sat on the porch in the evenings and watched the same hills she had watched for more than 50 years and found she was not sorrowful. She was grateful. Deeply, specifically, completely grateful in the way of someone who had looked at a life they'd been handed and built something from it that exceeded every reasonable expectation. She told her grandchildren the story often. Not the romantic version. She had no patience for the soft focus retelling that leaves out the hard parts. She told them the real one. The advertisement in the paper, the $31, the train ride through the widening country, the gray-eyed man who had said we'll see on the first day, and meant it as a fair challenge. She told them about the horses and the fence line and the fire. She told them about the slow turning of a practical arrangement into something that outlasted the arrangement entirely. She told them that the most important thing she had ever done was refuse to be smaller than she was, and that the most important thing Jacob Holt had ever done was recognize that and build around it rather than against it. He sent for a bride who could handle a horse, she'd say. He got a great deal more than he asked for. We both did. Her granddaughter Emma, Clara's youngest, fierce and impatient and brilliant, asked her once, "Were you ever afraid when you got on that train with nothing?" Ruth considered it honestly. "Every single mile," she said. "But fear is just information. It tells you what's at stake, and if something is at stake, it means it matters." She looked at the girl. "The question is never whether you're afraid. The question is whether what you're going toward is worth the fear." Emma looked at her for a long moment. Was it? Ruth looked out at the ranch, the hills, the barn that had been built and burned and built again, the corrals where her daughter was working a young horse with calm, absolute authority. "Look around you," she said. Emma looked. "All of this," Ruth said quietly, "started with a woman who had $31 and a way with horses and enough nerve to say plainly what she could do." She let that settle. "Yes," she said, "it was worth it, every mile of it.